Okay, so we're talking about why content modeling is so hot right now, which is content modeling, and it is quite hot right now. The sun's just come out, so but we've got quite a lot to get through. But I think the reason I want to talk about this is content modeling seems to be becoming more and more important in the way that we design websites, the way that we think about our services. And it's something I've noticed over the last while. It's been around for a long time, but actually it's coming up more and more as a way of doing it. More people are writing books about it, talking about the methodologies, and some of you may have lots of experience of it, and some from quite a technical perspective. Some of you may not really have thought about this at all before. So the idea of this session is hopefully there's something for everyone in here in terms of an introduction, but also exploring how to actually do it, not just understand what it is. That is the aim of the session. Just to introduce myself a little bit. I'm a content strategist, like Emma said, which I have represented with a hockey stick, which is a long story, but the metaphor is a content first metaphor, i.e. We're all quite guilty at times of designing the box for the present first and then saying, what's the present that needs to go in here again? And in the example where you've got a nice medium-sized square box and then the present is a hockey stick, you can see why you wanted to think about your content before you thought about the container it went in. So that's my nutshell definition of content first and content strategy. I basically come to projects with a content lens on, I guess. So I look at things in terms of what content have we got, what we're working with, what do we want to have, what will produce the results we want, how will we publish it, how will we migrate it, what shape does it need to be in, and that's content strategy. But like I say, more and more involved in content modeling as part of that. A little bit of a bio. This is just up the road, somewhere that I walk the dogs. I live in Somerset. That's a couple of my boys there. I've got 4 boys with 2 legs each, and then I've got 2 girls who have 4 legs each, so same number of legs. But I won't tell you which are the easier to live with. And that's me. So let's get into this content modeling malarkey. We're going to talk about what it is, we're going to talk about why it's so important, and we're going to talk about how to get going doing it. So first of all, just by way of definition, what is content modeling? I find this so interesting. You see, more and more I find the content model is one of the most important content strategy tools at my disposal. That was from a definitive article on content modeling that Rachel Lovinger wrote for A List Apart in 2012. So we're going back 8 years to say, look, this is becoming really important. It really is nothing new. But I think one of the differences now is that CMSs and other systems actually allow you to build structure into the system. So it's something that we are doing at Contensis, and is really important to us, is that you can model things out, but you can then actually build with that model. And I think because of that, content modeling is back on the agenda as an important way to tackle projects. Certainly digital strategy seems to have homed in on content modeling as a foundation for digital services. So just as a real simple understanding of content modeling, it's identifying the constituent parts of content, defining their attributes, and then defining their relationships to each other. So the content model is behind what we might call connected content, or in some wider context, structured content or modeled content. It's the model behind that. The problem, I guess, that we're tackling when it comes to this, and this is a helpful way to look at it, is in most of our systems, content exists in undifferentiated blobs, essentially. We often call them pages. They often are pages in our websites. So we build and design these blobs at great expense to look good for users. And in reality, they're one big unwieldy block of dressed up content, all welded together. So that gives us a number of problems right off the bat. The content's stuck in the pages, so it's not flexible. You can't break it up and use some parts elsewhere, or combine part of one page with another easily without recreating it. It's not reusable, So if you want something to appear in other places, basically you've got to put it in again. So that doesn't make it scalable either. It's not easy to manage, i.e. move around to different places, but also think about governing that kind of content, keeping track of it. So it's not easy to maintain. If you want to make corrections, how do you know you've got every single instance of where that thing appears if in fact it's all tied into different blocks in different places? So you can end up with a lot of errors. It also isn't easily searchable when it's in that, when it's presented that way, because a search system or search engine or internal search can't easily access the meaning of what makes up that block. It isn't necessarily ready to display on every device, and because it's undifferentiated, when it comes to redesign, you're sort of starting from scratch. We're going to do the whole thing all over again. That makes it hard to migrate as well if you wanted to move it into a different system, and it's not particularly open to other systems as well. So we'll think more about how to solve those later on, but that's just to present some of the challenges we've got when our content is actually in undifferentiated blobs or blocks. So the content modeling, the whole point would be to break content down into its constituent parts, into its reusable parts. So in that example we had just there, you might say, okay, on a typical page, actually, we've got headings, we've got paragraphs, we've got lists, images, links, dates, statuses, criteria, maybe there's a price on there or prices. There's also metadata. So for example, the page title, there might be tags associated with that page. We can actually say there are different elements that make up this page. And then if we wanted to define each of those parts, we could start to say, what actually are they? So I don't mean this is a heading, this is a paragraph. I mean, let's imagine a course page in a university. You might be able to say, well, this is the course title. This is an overview. So it's not just a paragraph, it's an overview, and all of our courses have this overview. So it's actually an element that's important on a course page, as are the modules, as is the start date. So we're beginning to define them and label them and describe them. And when we break them down like this, we're saying that we'll be able to sort and filter content based on these specific types. We'll be able to look for them, we'll be able to share them. And it's important to note that we can make as many different entries or instances of each one as we want. And it's still the same content type. For example, the course title for chemical engineering would be chemical engineering. But for biology, even though it's different, it's biology, the text is different, the actual title type is the same. All our courses need that type. They all need a title, and it has the same properties. Maybe it's got a maximum length. When it comes to design, it's presented in a certain way. So you can have as many course titles as you like, but it's actually just one type of content, and we're beginning to realize that. Then in our model, so we've broken it down into parts. This is the basic way that we model. Then we're labeling, defining, and then we understand how those parts relate to each other. So what are the relationships between them? And we know that these are elements of a course, and it might be that lots of those, basically we say there's a bigger thing going on here, which is called a course, and the title belongs to it, the overview belongs to it, modules belong to it, etc. But also, if we start to think about it in a bit more detail, start date is really interesting, because the same course can have, and does have, I imagine, multiple years of entry. If it's a course that runs every year with a new cohort every year, you might actually have chemical engineering run that started in 2018, started in 2019, same course, but started in 2020. And we don't want to treat those exactly the same, because it's time for clearing. We want to put the 2020 course into clearing, but we don't want to put the 2019 course into clearing. Students on the 2018 course have different requirements to those who are looking at doing that course in maybe 2022. So we notice it's the same course, but actually the date has a different relationship. We might be pulling at a thread here that has quite a lot of consequences in how we model this. So I'm not going to go into detail of that, But it's just interesting that this is the sort of thing that we do when we're modeling, is look at these relationships and start to work it out. It might be that therefore entry requirements belongs or is connected to start date rather than the wider course. Something else you might notice there is an image gallery actually be quite easy to break down further into individual images and then the presentation of them as a gallery. So there's a relationship that as we explore that, we actually start to break it down further and understand the model a bit better. So all of this is just to show you that content modeling is fundamentally breaking into parts, labeling those parts, understanding their relationships. It's a structure first approach to projects, the idea being that we design structure first, then we design content, and actually then we design the interface. So in that process, you're not getting to interface design and an interface designer having to decide lots of things about priority of content hierarchy, information architecture, layout. Often those decisions do come to designers, or they do come to developers when prototypes are passed through to them, and actually there are fundamental questions about structure that haven't been answered, and they say, right, well, do I just make something up? Is anyone around that I can research this with? Actually, the whole idea is to put structure first, define those things at the beginning, and then you've got a map for everybody to work off further down the line. It makes everyone's jobs further down the line much easier. That's the idea of structure first. I like this idea that your content model is the design behind the design. So lots of decisions are already evident by the time you get to, for example, interface design or build. They're inherent in the structure that you've created. Now, I am a huge advocate of content first approach to anything. But one of the things that I find is true is that structure first is content first. For example, when I put this presentation together, I didn't just slide by slide think what I needed. I thought, no, I should have some structure. I should have some templates that produce the repeatable content that I want. For example, bullet points, full images, quotes, headings, slides. But to create those templates, I didn't just make them up and then see if my content fitted. I thought, what is my content? What does a heading? What are my headings? What do my bullet points look like? How long are they generally? How will images fit into this? What if I want to do something more complicated? I'm thinking about my content so I can get the structure right. So actually, structure first makes you work in a content first kind of way and answer those questions up front. The other thing I think is true is it's really important. We talk about this all the time, being user-centered, putting user needs first. Structure first is also putting users first, because structure is based on objects. The structure is based on things that are in your system. And I'm sure you've had the slap of the face lots of times before when you realize users are not interested in your website. They're not interested in our website. They're not interested in your website. They're not interested in our organizations particularly. They are interested in the things that we have on the site that are relevant to them, that meet needs that they have. And when you approach projects with a structure first approach, then you're actually starting to put things in order, which are the things that users are interested in. You're adding meaning to your content by turning it into sortable data, which can be read by systems like your CMS, search engines, external systems. But it's also, when you add that meaning to your content, better understood by editors, by developers, and indeed by users. So users are very much at the center when you have a structure first approach. I mean, some of the things that we found are that content modeling actually brings people who work in content like me and developers together right at the beginning of a project. We're doing content modeling at the start of projects, and straight away I'm working with developers on what a model is for something we're working on. It's bringing content strategy together with the people who are building, and we've got a joint investment in actually let's get this model right. The other thing I think it does, I mean, lots of discovery work does this, but it actually brings you and us together. The content model is something that is a huge benefit for us in being able to build the right solution for you, but there's lots of benefits for you in understanding your own model and organizing things that way. So to get the model sorted at the beginning is really helpful. I want to show just a couple of examples, just high level, but some places that modeling has really helped. When we're working with Ordnance Survey on their business and government section, we found that, as you'd expect, they have an awful lot of content, and it's quite, there's some complicated stuff in there. And by that, I mean, on the leisure side, you want to buy a map, you choose the area, you buy a map, or you buy an app that has that information in it. On the government side, it's actually quite hard to understand how you end up using the data which is there. And on top of that, the content required to help users in that regard is owned by lots of different departments in what's understandably a very big organization. So it's quite a challenge to create a simple way for users to get what they need. And when we did some modeling work on Ordnance Survey, we discovered that actually, yes, it's complicated, but it boils down to 3 pillars. So there's a product, there's a license or an agreement to use that product, and then a partner or an organization or someone who can help you show you what system you need to use the product. And even though there are lots of variables for each of those 3, once we realized that they were the fundamental 3 pillars of how someone accesses Ordnance Survey's data on the business and government side, everything else from a structural point of view, information architecture fell in place around it. So that was a high level model that actually really helped us in helping them to structure things. On the other, so I mean, that's an example of where actually a large complex information architecture might not mean that the content model itself is actually very complicated. On the other hand, you might have something, we have a project going on at the moment where you might have some relatively simple user needs on the surface that farmers need to find data to choose a herbicide, for example, but then there might be so many nuances in the data when you're actually dealing with data that looks like this. There might be so many different things going on in there that the content model actually is much more complicated. So you can have fairly simple user needs, and behind the scenes, like the duck paddling furiously under the water, you've got a model that's doing a lot of heavy lifting. But that's exactly why you need to do the modeling, to make an effortless user journey at the front end. I think it's no secret that university courses, I've used that as an example already, they're one of the most complex content types that we build, and they are complex to model, but that's exactly why we should model them out, rather than getting further down the line saying, but what about this thing that a year, each course is different to the actual canonical course details that always stay the same, and you've got the different chunks that fit into the course model. We need to understand that stuff up front. It saves so much pain further down the line. So some reasons why you should model the content. I think we've touched on lots of them already, but I want to split this into 2, excuse me. First of all, think about why you would do this on paper, why you would model your content on paper, rather than jumping into actually building a structure in the CMS, for example. We need to design content that is stored, structured, and connected outside any user interface in a way that's readable and understandable by both people and computers. So say Mike Atherton and Carrie Hayne in their book Designing Connected Content, which would be my #1 book recommendation to find out more on this subject. It's a really excellent book, and there'll be more from it in a little while. This idea that actually the model exists outside of the system. So the benefits of modeling on paper or digital equivalent first are you actually end up understanding your content in a much deeper way. You have to look at what you've got, how it's structured, how it fits together. It's a form of audit. You can't really hide from it, but actually it's much easier than an inventory or an information architecture where you look at every single thing that you've got. You're looking at every single instance and entry that you've got. It's not about that. It's looking at the shared patterns, the shared content types that you've got. So again, you might have a big complex, you might have thousands and thousands of pages that boil down to just a few content types. But what you do need to do is have a look and find out and discover what's there. It's such a helpful thing to do. When you do that, you'll find that you develop a shared language. So when we capture the model, we have to call things things. And you find that the thing that you call this, someone else calls that in the organization. When you make the model agree on it together, we're talking the same language. Much easier to make requests of each other then, much easier to collaborate together. It brings an alignment, which is great. So that's one way it brings teams together. The other way is actually working together on the model. Like I've said already, content development brought together, stakeholders getting involved early on with the model before we have fights about what's on the homepage. Hey, let's look at the model. What do we actually have that users want? And we start to model it out. So the content model belongs to everyone at this stage, which is why it helps us to work together. Other reasons, it helps us define and formalize the relationships between content, which is going to guide us in the future. Actually really helps your content strategy, because to be included in the model, something needs to be important enough. We're not going to put lots of energy into including it in the model, spend time in it when it doesn't need to be there. So it's a way of actually stripping out stuff that doesn't need to be there. And I mentioned stakeholders being involved in looking at content models early on. It helps them often to understand the scale of what's going on and the priority of different types of content as well, when you can see the important things in the center of your model. It puts users at the center. We've already touched on that. And actually, it's much easier at this point, theoretically, if you're using sticky notes, to discard a sticky note when we know that the thing on there doesn't meet a user need than it is later to try and delete sections from a website. So it's a perfect low-cost way of refining what we're doing, developing structure inexpensively. Okay, so that's modeling on paper, and then reasons to model in the CMS. So in other words, you're structuring your content in the CMS so that model that you've got on paper actually works, and that's the way it works together. Too often today's content is fixed, stuck to individual pages or in device-specific applications. But as connected devices get more varied, robust, and ubiquitous, and as users expect to find, relate, and share content in more and more ways, we need content that can go anywhere, its meaning and message intact. So says Sarah Wachter-Becher. And that's what we're talking about, is getting content into that shape. And there's so many benefits when it's in that shape. So new content that you create will be focused because it's guided by a model that you've got when you know what each content type needs. So in the system, you can make sure that all new content created meets user needs, it meets your guidelines, it's in the right shape, it's complete. It's much easier to edit and maintain content efficiently because you change something once, for example, a phone number attached to a person, and it changes everywhere, which means you've got higher quality and consistency. Because you've not missed one out by accident, which leads to consequences further down the road. You've got fewer mistakes, omissions. Your content's reusable and it's flexible, so you can start to imagine new combinations, which up to this point just haven't been possible. What happens if we bring this module from over here and start to display it with this content over here? And you can just take the parts that you want and combine them. Your services become scalable because you can have one content type with 1 million entries. You don't have to reinvent the wheel each time you add a new entry, so there's an efficiency there. Content is more findable and easier to search. We've already touched on that, so your site search can be more accurate in terms of filtering by attributes or having a faceted search relating to content types, but also thinking about search engine optimization. When search engines understand what they're looking at, they're able to display it to users much more accurately. And you're actually going to reduce pitfalls like duplication or badly structured content that Google might penalize when you've got things structured and tagged up in the right way. So the more meaning you can add to your content types, your content model, the better. And some of you will know about schema.org, which is basically a repository of lots and lots of global tags or content types you can add to your content to give meaning, which are recognized by search engines, so that when you search for the University of Waterloo, for example, then up comes this information down the side of the search results, and it's able to present to people distinct bits of information, properly labeled, clearly signposted for people to understand. You don't have to pay to be there. Your content is prepared for people who are looking for it in the right way. And Google is only too happy to link your good content with people who need it. Some other reasons: services are scalable, content's more findable, easy to search, and your site works on any device now. So it's just a given that we can show it in different ways on different devices. It's the same thing, but it's not tied into one block that struggles on certain sizes or certain devices or certain browsers. It's easy to present it well for the best cross-device user experience, and then into the future, whatever comes up next, whether it's smart ones of these, or smart ones of these, or smart ones of these in your car, or smart one of these on your face, whatever it is, your content is ready for it. So big display boards, small watches, whatever. I mean, there are more reasons. When you've got your content structured in your system, then actually redesigns aren't heavy because content and design are separate. So changing the visual design is actually reskinning what's there. And if you design by using a design system, it's even easier. You change the design system, you've got essentially structured design then and structured content, and it just works. Similarly, changing CMS, not that you'd ever want to, but is less heavier thing as well, because your content's in a position, is structured already, so it should be less work to move things into different systems or use different systems. Your content's open to everyone through APIs as well, so it's actually available to the whole world through application programming interfaces. You're essentially setting your content free. So there's good reasons to model your content on paper, good reasons to build systems with modeled content, structured content. I want to spend the last part of the talk getting us going on how to do it. So how we model content, and this will be it's just an overview. There's lots more detail to dig into, but I want to mention three things. So the first is mapping the subject domain. The second is creating your content model. And then the third one is building it into the system. So mapping the subject domain, creating the content model, and then building it into the system. By subject domain, we're talking about this. So design your content and interfaces around the things people care about. You'll better serve their needs. There's a network of concepts and relationships inherent in any subject domain, an infrastructure to underpin all current and future work. So you have a field of interest, and in that field of interest, there is stuff, and users are interested in that stuff, and we want to map it. So here's an example subject domain model. It's showing the objects in a field of interest, in this case, farming, and well, growing crops specifically, and the relationships between them. So we've got the objects and the relationships between them. And some of you might be thinking, oh, why put this domain model before we get into our specific content model? Why do we have to do that wider picture first? Can't we just get on with the content model already? The advantages of domain mapping, just briefly, effectively you're exposing the territory that you're building into ahead of making your detailed model. It prevents you making the same mistakes again, i.e. if you just work from the current system that you have and your current understanding, then you might have the same blind spots. looking at the domain wider separates design from content. So you're less likely to think in the ruts that your current design already has. You can actually just step back and say, what actually makes up an event? We have events. What actually makes up an event, rather than what are the restrictions of our calendar? So it makes sure that you don't miss anything as well. With the stuff that we've already got is enough work to be doing what we've got on our plate already. And actually we don't want to add anything more, but we might be missing a fundamental object that users care about. So the domain model will make sure that we bring that in. It gets teams and stakeholders involved early, and it keeps you focused on the user by looking at the stuff that they care about. So domain modeling is effectively finding the objects in your underlying area of interest. And I know that I'd have thought for all of you, your area of interest is already really clear, as in if what you do is services as part of local government, or if you're a university and you're working in higher education, effectively you know what your area of interest is. But just in case you don't, here's some ways to find the objects in your subject domain. Desk research, and in particular paying attention to professional bodies that operate in your field, and forums where real users talk about stuff. So that can be really good for labels and the language that they actually use. Interviews with experts, so subject experts, and finding out the things that they work on and work with and talk about. And obviously user research, not just forums, but talking directly to users wherever you can. And a good question here is, what user research already exists in your organization? It might not have been done for the same reason that you want it for, but you can look through it and find the language that people use, the things that people talk about. So let's take this as an example. Here are some things which are in the field of interest in higher education. So let's think about a university for a moment. There are lots of things here, already slightly grouped by color, largely just to make it easier on the eye, because there are so many of them. There's a lot more in real life, we know that, but that's plenty to be going on with. Some of the things to think about with our subject domain then, we want to set objects at the right level. So what I mean by that is, if we go back to this, we can see that we've got undergrad and postgrad courses on there. Now, there's a good case to be made to say that actually they contain very similar elements overall, and the course could be this, those two courses could be part of the same object. Could find a new name for those courses. It might be a full-time course, and that's the object. But if we just call them courses, maybe that would be too broad. Maybe full-time doesn't work either, but this is what we need to think about. Courses might be too broad, because what about short courses, online courses, other things, courses within courses? So we've got to think about what we combine and what we leave separate. Another example on this model would be, here are all the people. We've got students up in there in pink. We've got staff, including lecturers, professional services, and leaders in grey. There's a business partner there, research manager in green. We've got different people in the model, but we wouldn't want to combine them all into one type, which was person, I don't think, because their roles are so very different. But we could possibly combine all the students. We could possibly combine all the staff. That might be a useful thing to do. So we've got to make sure that we've got consistency and we've got the right level for the objects. Second thing to say is, objects aren't instances or entries. In other words, the Lady Margaret Hall might be an instance of a lecture theatre, but the important object to put in our map is lecture theatres, because there's another one down the road, and then there's 3 others somewhere else. So lecture theatre is the object. The name, Lady Margaret Hall, is an instance of it. So we're dealing with objects. Got to make sure we stay in the domain. So obviously everything's connected to everything. A good example on this map is town or city. You might start thinking, hey, we could list out all the services that are in my town for students. And you start to suddenly get a very big model indeed, because they lead to something else, they lead to something else, and actually it's important to know when to stop. I know it's a really a bit of a cliched example now, but when gov.uk first started digitizing their services properly and going through it all, they discarded thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of things like beekeeping advice, because does the government need to be the organization that gives advice on beekeeping to people in the country? Are there other people who do that better somewhere else? It's kind of more in their domain. The answer was yes, and they got rid of loads that way. And so it's important that we sort of stay in our lane and that we know what it is that's kind of the core things that we need to provide and our users are concerned with. And then finally, we're talking about objects, not attributes. Attribute is a property of an object that doesn't need to be further defined itself. In fact, it could be that the city or the town you're in is an attribute of other content types. Even though your city might be vast, its place in your model actually might be quite small. It might, sure, it's important that people know which city they're coming to, but it still might just be an attribute of the location. We'll talk about attributes more in a minute. So we've got this map, we've got our objects, we want to link objects together and define the links. So we might have some university objects here, and they might relate in all kinds of different ways. They do relate in all kinds of different ways. We know that. So let's just zoom in on this example. We've got an event on there. We've got team/staff member. So that's already an object that's been combined a few different roles. And we want to say, right, how do these things interrelate? So let's add some relationships. So a course has events in it. An event is run by people in different ways. So we could have said, actually that relationship needs to be quite general, run by, rather than thinking about, well, there are lecturers, but there are also administrators that, it needs to cover all of those. Staff members have contact information. Why have we separated the contact out from the people? Well, because venues also have contact information. So we can see that within the model, actually, if something is reusable for lots of other types when it comes to relationships, then we can separate it, make it easier. A venue is located in a location. That's because the same location might hold many venues if it's a single building with lots of different venues in it. So its location, which doesn't change, is worth having as a separate object. Generally speaking, the bigger object comes first in the way you express a relationship. So a course, the big thing, has events as part of it. So we put has events rather than event is part of a course. But it doesn't matter that much as long as you've got a consistency and you understand it. As we start looking at these relationships, it's a really good test of the objects, because we could make a case here for saying, actually, we need a role. That thing I said about there are lots of different roles when it comes to running events is run by two general. Actually, we want to say role is an object in its own right, in which case a team or staff member has roles. Roles are part of delivering a course, and then also there are different roles involved in different events. People will change, but roles generally stay the same for those things. That could be another way of breaking it up. So that's an introduction to domain models. How to do it? Well, my answer is almost always post-it notes, as you can see, and a whiteboard or a flip chart paper that you can roll up and take with you. Or if you want to do it online, there's various things like Google Jamboard. You can do this similar kind of thing collaboratively. But the important thing is, I think, physically spread out, easy to change, easy to move around, easy for different people to come in and have a go, have a look, review it. And slowly you build your model up with lots of involvement. So that's the subject domain. And the next step then is to get more specific about your content model. So what we're looking for now is we're looking to put the detail in for those content types. So turn the objects into content types. So the content model is a detailed map of the content that you publish. First thing we'll do then is reduce the field, because maybe you don't have content for everything in your domain model. It's not part of your core business. There's a good question there. Should it be part of your core business? Is it that you're not able to produce that stuff or aren't going to be in the foreseeable future, in which case you have to model around that? These are really good questions. And that's one of the benefits of this modeling. It makes you think about that. And we've got to be realistic about this. So a conversation we have all the time with people is, what can we do now? And then maybe what's for a phase further down the line. But actually, modeling lends itself to that kind of approach. We don't have to do it all at once. We can extend a model, or we can model it all out now, but we know that we're not able to produce more than this core part or this module here first. So it's actually a really helpful way of looking at it. Maybe content comes from somewhere else, a load of it. It's not actually part of your content model. It comes in from somewhere else, in which case we need to understand it, and we understand what content we're getting, what data we're pulling in from elsewhere. Again, really important things to be thinking about. So like I said, objects from the domain become content types for your content model. Content types are the reusable containers for your content. The reusable containers for your content. So if we look at this example we had just now, how these things interrelate, we're going to zoom in on the event. What are the things that make up an event? That's how we're going to build our content type for event. Content types have attributes. So an attribute is a characteristic or quality of an object. And the best example I can think of is Top Trumps card. So the content type is Star Wars character. We know there are lots of different ones of those, but for the game of Top Trumps, we don't need to know everything about them. We just need their age, height, force, fighting, humility, and appearances. So Princess Leia is an entry or an instance of the content type of Star Wars character, and then she's got those attributes, as do all the other characters. So if we apply that to event, there we go. Event might have an event name, a description, a date, a time, a duration, etc. You're listing the qualities of an event that you want to capture. We're still thinking about pre-system, so we don't need to start designing the interface yet. We don't need to think about images at this point, although I did think we'd include description as an important part of understanding what an event is beyond just its name. But what we do notice is that some of those attributes that I've now put into orange actually are expressed in relationships already. So we could model it like this. We take those out and show them as the relationships to the other parts of the model, which I haven't put in full there, but you can see that an event is part of a course, it's hosted at a venue. A new one that came up in thinking about this is an event might be part of a series. So actually we need a new content type for series. The model is continually evolving. It's a working document, and it should be, rather than being fixed or you feeling it has to be perfect at any one point. Sometimes it goes the other way and you end up combining objects as you model it out. But what you're aiming for ultimately is that more detailed model with the attributes of each content type and how they relate together. And then the third thing is actually to design the model or build the model for your CMS, which has an asterisk on it, because when I'm talking to people who aren't Contensis users about this, I do have to say, as long as you can do it in your CMS. Obviously in Contensis, this is a huge priority for us, that we're able to do this with the information that you put in to give you the maximum flexibility with your content. So I'm pretty sure most of you have seen the inside of your CMS, but you might be on different versions. So this is an example of looking at content types within Contensis. And what we're doing now, so we've taken the model from the subject domain into content types, where we've reduced the field, we've added the attributes. Now we're adding digital properties to the different content types. So this is where we might start to say, right, images are going to be useful we want to present events with images. Actually, maybe it's useful to have a thumbnail image specifically. Maybe a summary is good for when we have search results and want to show summary of something rather than the whole description. There might be a status if actually you're able to book an event online. We might have a call to action always with an event, because that's a good reminder that to keep it task focused, make sure users can book. It's really important. You might have an event type, so you're actually grouping it in different ways. These are examples of digital properties rather than just the attributes. You might say, I want to show related events with any one event, in which case you have to ask the question, what does that mean? That's a very good question, and one that you should be asking, and is, will inform the model. So in this case, I've said, hey, related events might be that they share the same theme, in which case we need that as an attribute. We need theme as an attribute of event so that we can pull the ones together. Another way of looking at this is to say, imagine an event in the wild. What are the different things we want to be able to show, but how do we want users to be able to cut this? How do we want users to be able to sort it and filter it? How do we want to be able to show related events? And you can actually work backwards from there to say, right, in that case, we need to tag it in a certain way, or we need to add certain attributes to the model. So very quickly now, because I know time is up. So some content types are generically digital. By that, I mean things like announcements that you want to put on your homepage or anywhere on the site that a visitor arrives first, blog posts, articles, media, ways of showing media. These are actually generically digital content types that don't necessarily exist with the content types that we defined in the first place, but will exist when we present stuff digitally. Great. So then what we're doing is refining the relationships as it goes in the CMS. That comes down to how things actually work in the CMS, how things actually work in Contensis. You can handle things in different ways. You know, the date system might be to do with start and end date, or it might be to do with a start date in a number of days. For example, the model, I think, has to be flexible, and it will change as we put it into the CMS. And this is the last thing to show you. Oh no, it's not. It's the second last thing to show you, is that how to capture the detail. So by the time we get to this point, we've got those digital properties coming in. This is just an example of a content type, in this case, a weed. And when we think about that coming into the CMS, we've got the attributes of it, its name, its scientific name, its alternative names, but also we've got its relationships. So it belongs to a weed group, it's susceptible at a weed stage, it's treated by herbicides, etc. And then what we're doing here for the detail is actually, when we map content types like this, is provide example content so we understand exactly what we're dealing with. And then can we actually nail down the taxonomy for that? So when you say it belongs to a weed group, what are all the different weed groups? What's a weed stage? And capturing the taxonomies there. And also in this spreadsheet, we've got any notes that go with that. Sometimes when we have this kind of capture of information, we would have a column for whether it's mandatory or not. So when you create this in your system, does it have to be there or not? And also maybe you want to capture the actual field type, for example, formatted text, a Boolean, a list, an image, etc. So just to show you that quickly, some of you work with these all the time, I know. And the final thing to say is, often we get the question, what about my homepage? What content type is that? Where does that fit in? That would be an example of a content assembly where several types are combined together to create that page. So there's a nice homepage. Home pages, category landing pages, marketing landing pages, rich media stories, things like that. We're actually pulling different content types together to produce those. Very much thinking beyond the page. It's very much about setting your content free. So that is that. And if you want to read more, there's a few places to start there. There's lots of places to follow up about structured content, about modeling content. There's a few places to start.